Thank you, Brooke. I bring you birthday greetings from William Blake. Rise now, drive your cart and plow over the bones of the dead. Thanks for coming out for this amazing artist and poet and painter. I'm really looking forward to informing you about him and sharing a discussion with you about him. Here's our passage tonight. If you haven't been here before, this is what we do in this series. We just take a passage from literature or wherever, talk about it, provide some context and then talk about it. And we have great fun doing this. By the way, don't forget our fall series is Los Angeles Stories, and we've got that ready to go now. So if you love this city or if you hate this city, a lot of the writers will be talking about hate this city. Come out for that, plan for that this fall. We're also, I don't think I'm premature in saying this, we're going to have a screening series along with screening Sundays along with that series. So not every week, of course, but once a month we'll have a Los Angeles film to go along with our talks about the city of angels. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man and woman as it is, infinite. For men and women have closed themselves up till we see all things through narrow chinks of our cavern. You may know that as Aldous Huxley, or you may know that as Jim Morrison, but it comes from this man, William Blake. All right, who was this guy? Very interesting person. That's a self-engraving right there. Born 1757, died 1827. Notice those dates. They are extremely important for Blake. So you've got the American Revolution. He's British. And you've got the American Revolution and the French Revolution on either side of him. And he incorporates this into his mysticism. It has been suggested, and there's some evidence of this, that he was, or at least his ancestors were part of the Moravian church. Now, this is a really interesting phenomenon. Remember last time we were talking about Marjorie Kemp and how there was just this fomenting of rebellion or reformation, we might say, against the Catholic Church. And Marjorie was not really interested in that, but her mystical experiences certainly were precursors to that, because she was experiencing Christ directly without the intercession of a priest or the church. And so it now comes full flower with Johann Huss, a man from what we would call the Czech Republic, and the founder of the Moravian Church, which is really the oldest Protestant denomination, even before Luther. So it's possible, even likely, I would say, that Blake was exposed to this Reformation movement before the Reformation. It is said that, and I think this is right, he has a biographer from not long after he died, just a few decades after he died. So we have some really good information on Blake. And it was said that Blake viewed the world in the light of what Wordsworth called a visionary gleam. And if you know anything about William Blake, you know that is so true. A visionary gleam. It's not that many artists who have that, frankly. Another was William Butler Yeats, who would come along much later, or somewhat later. And then one of the defining features of Blake's life is a vision of angels that he had as a child. So he was 9, and he was walking along and told his parents that he saw a tree filled with angels. And he later reported other visions of angels walking in a field among workers as they gathered hay, right? Because Isn't that in itself interesting that the angels are with the workers? Wouldn't they be in the cathedrals? No, they're with the workers for Blake's vision. And he never outgrew these visions. As you'll see, he turned them into art. His father punished him for his vision because he thought he was making it up. But it did not deter him. And then they continued until when he was past 50. He keeps seeing angels and heavenly figures. Says he saw that he was over 50. He's seeing the sunrise, and he writes that he sees an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." Okay, now you can sing that. You can't see that. You're not supposed to see that. But he saw it and incorporated it, as I said, into his art. He sent to drawing school, a very famous drawing school. His father and mother do kind of see some talent in him early on, and he goes to, this might be after the art school, I'm trying to remember this. He goes to the most famous engraver in London at the time, and his father introduces William Blake to this man, and William Blake recoils and says, this man has a face like he's about to be hanged. And he was hanged 12 years later. So this dude already is touching something that other people aren't privy to. But he learned basic drawing skills at Henry Parr's drawing school that his father got him into, and it connected into classical works from Greece and Rome. Good. Then he becomes an engraver in 1772. He does an apprenticeship under a different engraver, not the guy who was about to be hanged, and appreciated this teacher's simple line drawings. A lot of the contemporary art world at the time thought that was outdated, but this fit well with what Blake liked, and you'll see is these simple lines. He really liked Dürer, for example. All right. He was an integrative artist. Isn't that amazing? That's an etching of a vision his brother had. 1779, he's age 21, and he completed his apprenticeship and became a copy engraver. Now, in summer of 1780, something interesting happens. It was a rough time in England, anti-Catholic demonstrations everywhere. The Gordon riots spread through London, and Blake saw all this firsthand. He and his wife lived in London, of course. And his biographer, the one I mentioned, Alexander Gilchrist, says that on June 6th, the third day of the Gordon riots, that Blake was involuntarily swept along before a large mob and watched as it stormed and burned Newgate Prison. He was swept along. Later that same summer, he took a trip with his friend Thomas Stoddard up the River Medway and was arrested because they thought he was a spy. He and his friends were spies. Far worse, they were artists. He becomes a painter at the Royal Academy of Arts School of Design, and got formal training there. And as you will see that he deploys that formal training in his work too, as well as his visions. Oh yeah, he's got this great line. They're wanting him to do, as teachers always are, they're wanting him to do with painting a certain way. And the keeper of the Royal Academy advised Blake to study Lebrun and Rubens instead of Raphael and Michelangelo, because Raphael and Michelangelo were stiff and unfinished, according to the director of the Royal Academy there. To which young William Blake replied, "These things that you call finished are not even begun." He was a poet. Early 1780s saw private publication of poetical sketches, a collection of poems he'd been writing over 14 years. And he's again connected with this tradition. This is the genius of Blake, is he knows what T.S. Eliot called tradition, but is also an individual talent. So he knows how to navigate this history, this artistic history, this literary history, and yet to express himself uniquely at the same time. It's quite a gift, as any of you who've tried to create something in the world will know. I love this. He hung out with something called the Matthew Circle. This is the Reverend A.S. Matthew and his wife Harriet, who hosted literary and artistic gatherings that Blake attended. And one of those who attended, some of you will recognize this name, was Thomas Taylor, a man known for the first English translations of Plato and Aristotle and other Greeks, first editions of which we have in our secret room. We really do. Yes, and as iconoclasts go, they can never last very long in a group, right? And so Blake gets disaffected by the Matthew Circle and wrote a satire. He didn't finish it because it was an island. It's called An Island Upon the Moon. He wasn't able to finish it, but it's a satire of the Matthew Circle, their social affectations and their ambitions. So he has characters in this called Inflammable Gas, G-A-S-S, Sip-Sop the Pythagorean, I want to meet that guy, and Mrs. Nana Cantipot. Okay, so this is, I don't know what this means, but I'll just read it to you. Blake's fellow guests gossip, philosophize, and show off their latest inventions, bursting frequently into song and at least once into flame. It was a great time in London and a weird time. He was husband to Catherine Butcher, and she was 1762 to 1831. She was amazing, and like many spouses of great artists, she was responsible for much of his genius. But you probably haven't heard her name. I'm happy to name her tonight. He married her in 1782. And I don't know how this worked, because it never really works, but he was recently rejected by another woman. And then he told Catherine this story, which is usually a warning sign, like, okay, stay away. Thanks, nice talking to you. But she pitied him and in turn won his affection. Listen, pity us, men, and we're in. We're all in. That's all we need. Well, at least for William Blake. They had apparently a unique marriage in that it was very happy. I was going to contextualize that to 18th century London, but I don't think I need to. Their marriage was happy, although there is this incident recorded by Gilchrist where Blake had this younger brother, Robert, who you're going to hear about in a minute, and his wife, Catherine, quarreled with Robert, which was not to be done, and Blake insisted that she kneel down and apologize to his younger brother. And then he invents relief etching, a different kind of, I'm actually going to show you a video of what it is, because I don't quite understand it, but there's someone who does and is doing it at the British Library. And then there is Robert Blake, not that Robert Blake, if you're old enough to remember that. This is his younger brother. Very important to William. Apparently, relief etching came to William through his dead brother. Robert had died in February 1787, and Blake was at his bedside constantly for 2 weeks and reportedly collapsed into a continuous sleep for 3 days and 3 nights. Really? 3 days and 3 nights. Okay. After his brother's death, and then he arose again on the 3rd day. He continued to see his brother in visions, very close. And in fact, in one such vision, Robert appears to him and instructs him in how to do relief etching. How nice. Thank you, Robert. This is a significant technological improvement, and it does affect Blake's work, as you'll see in the video I'm going to show you. Well, I'll let the guy explain, because I don't really know what I'm talking about. So here we go, Wes.
William Blake trained as an engraver for 7 years, beginning when he was age 12. It was in order to learn a trade as an artisan that would enable him to make a living. And indeed, he depended upon that for the rest of his life. Right from his earliest childhood, Blake was driven by 2 extraordinary and powerful aspirations. On the one hand as a poet, on the other as a painter. And as he matured, but even during adolescence and as a teenager and a young man, Blake was writing his first poems and making his first drawings. So how was he going to bring these 2 together in a form that would enable him to publish his own images in illustration of his own poems? From the 16th century down through, including the 17th and 18th and the beginnings of the 19th century, illustrated books were produced as the result of 2 workshops. On the one hand, a letterpress printer's workshop that was responsible for printing the text from raised lead type, and a rolling press or copperplate printer's workshop where the illustrations were printed and laid into the blank spaces left following the printing of the text. Both workshops employed a whole succession of specialists who were responsible for each stage in the production process. What's extraordinary is just how profound and far-reaching Blake's innovation was in terms of the production of his illustrated book of text and design, word and image. It enabled Blake, with the exception of making the paper, to be responsible for every stage in the production process, from writing the poems, making the drawings, using the stop-out varnish to write his text, etching, and printing the impressions. When Blake realized how he might achieve a means by which he could print himself both his text and his design in one printing process, he used the stop-out varnish like ink and the copperplate like a sheet of paper, and wrote his text in mirror writing onto the plate with the stop-out varnish and drew his design above, below, or interweaving it. The stop-out varnish is critical because once dry, it prevents the acid, the mordant, from biting into or dissolving the exposed areas of the copper surrounding it. His invention started with the choice of his pigments. Very limited: bone black, gamboge, yellow ochre, Prussian blue, madder lake, 2 or 3 others, so that Blake would take tiny portions of the dry pigment and place it on the stone, and then using this honey-like reduced linseed oil, put a drop of that on the stone, and with his palette knife work it in and work it in. Blake worked up a sort of a leather-covered dauber that he could then stomp into the ink that he prepared. And only with the very delicate, thin layers, gently touch or tap those raised surfaces. But because the pressure has to be controlled with such extraordinary skill, it's only possible to do this successfully by repeatedly, gently touching these raised surfaces and building up microscopic layer after layer of ink until the raised surfaces are fully inked and ready to be printed. Inking with a dauber also creates a certain kind of texture or surface to the ink that is like under a microscope, like the surface of the moon, with peaks and troughs and hollows, which gives us an extraordinary mottled effect when printed. With the plate inked, wiped, and prepared to be taken to the press, Blake would take it to the bed of the press, lay it face up on the sheet that had been marked. Gripping the star wheel of the press, hand over hand, the bed is passed between the two rollers, top and bottom, of the press, and emerges on the other side, with sufficient pressure having been exerted by the rollers to transfer the ink into the fabric of the paper. The wool blankets are then lifted back and out of the way, the waste sheet lifted and set to one side, and very carefully, often using a folded piece of paper to protect from any ink on the thumb and forefinger, the printed sheet would then be lifted away from the copper plate and taken over and laid down to be pressed and dried. In Blake's single room on the ground floor at number 13 Hercules Buildings in Lambeth, he did it all. Blake was an extraordinary original when it came to his thinking, his emphasis upon imagination, his antipathy toward, for example, to use but perhaps one of his best known expressions, the dark satanic mills, the grinding, the machinery, all these things that seem to dehumanize his fellow man. And there, right in the middle of his life, is this machine, this large, lumping, huge, wooden, heavy machine with this great star wheel that takes enormous pressure to turn and that creaks like a sailing ship and is absolutely at the center of his life. He's not a Shelley or a Wordsworth or a Keats with a fine quill pen and ethereal thoughts, staring up to heaven and glancing through his manuscripts and leisurely leaning back and contemplating what he's written and then passing it to his publisher to put it into press. Blake is a mechanic. He's this extraordinary man who is physical. Blake was not a big man, but he was enormously strong, enormously powerful. Yet, the creator of these extraordinary ideas and these extraordinary poems that just go right to the quick of our imagination and our heartthrob as human beings.
So that was about 8 minutes, but I hope it was worth it because, I don't know what that process is, and I learned a lot from that video. And what he says at the end is right. This is not Wordsworth in the Lake District with a little journal and a pen. This is effort. This is physical exertion to create poetry and art, and a unique, inventive process on its own. So, here are some of the works that he did using this process. All religions are one, and there is no natural religion. And he, of course, refines the process as he goes along, learns new things about it, and deploys it. Songs of Innocence, I'm going to read you a poem from that soon. And the Book of Hell, which is amazing and weird. An illuminated poem. In unrhymed lines of 14 syllables, a young shepherdess who receives advice from a lily, a cloud, and a clod of clay. only to flee in the end from a voice of sorrow that arises from her own grave. She's a pale and slender figure, clothed in a wispy gown, conversing with her anthropomorphic mentors in a world defined by delicate watercolors. Yeah. And then our text tonight is the marriage of heaven and hell. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But as you will see, it's an argument against a Christian mystic by the name of Emanuel Swedenborg, whom Blake was very interested in at the beginning because he was using mystical and artistic images. But then he found that Swedenborg didn't go far enough. And as you'll see soon, he mocks him for, well, not going to hell. How are you supposed to know about things, especially God and Christ and the truth, without going to hell? I think he says, I think I have it here. He says he didn't consult enough demons. He just spoke with angels. And that's right, isn't it? I mean, you've got to talk to the demons, of course. And then songs of experience that I'll share with you a poem from too. So he had some very interesting friends. He's hanging out with Mary Wollstonecraft, who Vindication of the Rights of Woman, very progressive thinker. And he's also, hanging out with William Godwin, author of Political Justice and Mary Shelley's father. And he's hanging out with Mary Shelley, of course, Joseph Priestley, Thomas Paine, the revolutionary. And in fact, there's a moment here where Thomas Paine is in trouble because he's writing Common Sense and these tracts against the crown. And he's in England hanging out with William Blake. And Blake told him after he was leaving his house one night, he says, "You're about to be arrested, I feel." And so he sent him down to the docks to get on a ship for France. And sure enough, it was just a few minutes later that the authorities had knocked on the door to pick up Thomas Paine. He was also great friends with a Swiss artist named Henry Fuseli. And this is Horsemen Attacked by a Giant Snake. And you can see some of the lines and colors there that were influential to both artists. Let's see. Fuseli says that Blake was a good artist to steal from. He said that. And so they became great friends. So, songs of innocence, songs of experience. This is Blake. This is Blake with duality. And transcending duality, not by going above it so much as going into it. Let me show you what I mean. This is The Lamb, a poem called The Lamb. You may have read this in elementary school, I don't know. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream or o'er the mead? Gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly bright. Gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek, he is mild, he became a little child. I a child and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee. Little lamb, God bless thee. Okay, so there's some theorizing that Blake was actually, I don't know if satirizing is the right word, but parodying may be the right word, children's literature of the time. Okay, so this is sickly sweet, right? I mean, you heard it. Ew, and it's just, okay, so that's Songs of Innocence, but this is This is to be embraced as much as the songs of experience. So, remember the lamb, right? The lamb reappears in Songs of Experience in the most famous Blake poem that you probably know called Tiger. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye did frame thy fearful symmetry, fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? And when the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye did frame thy fearful symmetry? There's a great book on Blake by Northrop Frye called Fearful Symmetry. And so you see here these dualities that Blake is working with. And let's see how he moves through them in his work. So in the final years of his life, he got a strange condition that is probably, he called it that sickness to which there is no name. I know when I get a cold, I call it the sickness unto death. So it was probably not as bad, maybe, as he described, but he does describe shivering fits, a gnawing pain in the stomach, and a deathly feel all over the limbs. And people who know say this is biliary cirrhosis. Okay. And interesting, why would you get biliary cirrhosis? You would get it if you were exposed to the fumes produced when acid is applied to copper plates. So he probably died for his infernal method, as he called it, of producing art. He did work right until the end and produce one of his most famous images that you see there, the Ancient of Days. And then it is said, because this is what we say of the dead, he died in a most glorious manner, one of his friends wrote. He said that he was going to that country he had all his life wished to see, and expressed himself happy, hoping for salvation through Jesus Christ. Just before he died, his countenance became fair, his eyes brightened, and he burst out singing of the things he saw in heaven. Good for you, William Blake. He was buried in 1827. And let's see here. Yes, his obituaries were not so kind as his friends' eulogies were. They emphasized his personal quirks, of which he had many. For example, in Gilchrist, I think it is, there's the story of one of his friends who comes to visit the Blakes, William and Catherine, and there's a little shed out in the garden, and they're both naked in the shed reading Paradise Lost, as one does. And the friend was taken aback, and he said, "Come on in, it's just Adam and Eve." The Literary Chronicle described him as, quote, one of those ingenious persons whose eccentricities were still more remarkable than their professional abilities. A view that persisted throughout his life, and it was really later on in the 19th century, a few decades later, that Blake became a great artist, which means, of course, that people can see what he was doing finally. Catherine, again, was his great partner and took care of him and his estate. She continued to sell his works, which no doubt helped his renown. Yes, I forgot about this. After her death, Blake's works were left in the hands of his friend Frederick Tatham, who destroyed them. Yeah. All right, so let's get to the text now. This is our marriage of heaven and hell. And here's what we have. And I'm showing you the images, of course, from the text. We have the argument. These are the kind of table of contents. The argument, the voice of the devil, because, right, we're not going to make Swedenborg's mistake. Memorable fancies, just little visions of walking through hell, or talking to angels, or Jesus, or whatever. And then the Proverbs of Hell that you're going to hear of tonight, and a Song of Liberty. He was very interested in the American Revolution and saw it, actually much like Manly Hall, he saw America itself as a mystical, spiritual development in world history. Yeah. All right, let's get to it. This is the marriage of heaven and hell. Blake. As a new heaven is begun, it is now 33 years since its advent. What's he talking about? Swedenborg said that the end of the world would have happened the year Blake was born. A new heaven is begun, and now it's 33 years since it arrived. So already, first sentence, a little stab at Emmanuel. And lo, Swedenborg is the angel sitting at the tomb. So you remember in the Gospels that, I forget which one, some of the disciples come and Jesus is risen, so he's not in the tomb, but there's an angel sitting there. So for Blake, this is Swedenborg. His writings, Swedenborg's writings, are the linen clothes of Jesus folded up. Oh, now that's how you take a dig at somebody, right? His writings, Jesus took off and laid down and went on to ascend into heaven. Brutal. And then what you get are these, it's hard to describe, and we'll talk about why it's hard to describe, but you get these aphorisms, these proverbs, these visions, and they're all kind of mushed together, and they're profound and maddening, and let me just give you a taste of it. So this is still the first section. Without contraries, there is no progression. Without contraries, there is no progression. Catch me in the right mood, and I'll argue that William Blake was the first post-structuralist, the first deconstructionist. He was Jacques Derrida before Derrida. Without contraries, there is no progression. Why is that so profound? Because we as a human race, spend most of our time creating contraries and choosing one over the other and stopping, right? Without the contraries are like gateposts for Blake. They're what you pass through, right? That's how you progress. Without contraries, there's no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. Necessary. Hate is necessary for human existence. From these contraries spring what the religious, those people, call good and evil. Good is the passive that obeys reason. Evil is the active springing from energy, capital E. Good is heaven, evil is hell. All Bibles or sacred codes have been the cause of the following errors. 1, that humanity has two real existing principles, a body and a soul. Okay, well, that has been the case since Plato and especially since Descartes. We want to talk about dualities? Here they are, the body and the soul. The mind-body problem, essentially. These are errors. that we have a body and a soul. That energy, this is the second error, that energy called evil is alone from the body. And that reason called good is alone from the soul. So when we try to get free of the mental and mythological structures that we've built, Blake was there. He was there already in the 18th century, saying it's an error to think of body and soul as separate. It's an error to connect evil with the body and good with the soul or the mind. And the third error is that God will torment man in eternity for following his energies. Error. So 3 errors. We have a body and a soul. Evil belongs to the body, good belongs to the soul, and that we will be tormented for following our energies. Wrong. Incorrect. The following contraries are true. Man has no body distinct from his soul, for that called body is a portion of the soul, discerned by the 5 senses, the chief inlets of soul in this age. No separation. Energy is the only life and is from the body. Reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy. Energy, remember, which in the prevailing mythology and ideology is evil. 3, energy is eternal delight. You see where we're going, right? Straight to hell. As I was walking along among the fires of hell, delighted with the enjoyments of hell's genius, he writes, which to angels look like torment and insanity, but we know better. He didn't say that last part. I collected some of their proverbs. This is genius, right? Just rhetorically, this is genius. I'm strolling along through hell, and this is what they say in hell. This is what's true in hell. I collected some of their proverbs, thinking that as sayings used in a nation, they mark its character. So the Proverbs of Hell show the nature of infernal wisdom better than any description of hell's buildings or garments. And when I came home on the abyss of the 5 senses, you ever been on the abyss of the 5 senses? Yeah, I thought you had. Where a flat-sided steep frowns over the present world, I saw a mighty devil folded in black clouds, hovering on the sides of the rock with corroding fires. He wrote the following sentence, now perceived by the minds of men and read by them on earth. Here's the sentence the devil writes using corroding fires. How do you know but every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight closed by your senses 5? What? Okay. How do you know, in other words, how do you know that not every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight? How do you not know that there's a whole world with every bird that you see crossing through the air that is beyond your senses? This is why I've loved William Blake my whole adult life. I've rarely understood him, but I don't care. I don't think he cares that much, because the point is to get beyond. It's just to get beyond. And this actually echoes some Taoist writings, like, you don't know much. You really ultimately don't know anything. But what you do think you know is confined to your space. And what do you know about a bird flying through the air? What do you know of that world? You don't know anything, except that maybe it's a whole other world that you don't know, which is worth knowing. So here are the Proverbs of Hell. Now, there are a lot of them. I won't inflict them on you, but I think you'll get it pretty quickly. These are the Proverbs of Hell. These must be lies, right? No, already you're too sophisticated for that. In seed time, learn. In harvest, teach. In winter, enjoy. Okay? Drive your cart and your plow over the bones of the dead, Brooke. Have you done that?
Occasionally.
I thought so. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. You probably heard that one. Yeah. Prudence is a rich, ugly old maid courted by incapacity. He who desires but acts not breeds pestilence. The cut worm forgives the plow. Dip him in the river who loves water. Hell, these are from hell. A fool sees not the same tree that a wise man sees. He whose face gives no light shall never become a star. Eternity is in love with the productions of time. You may have heard that one. It's right out of hell. The busy bee has no time for sorrow. The hours of folly are measured by the clock, but of wisdom no clock can measure. All wholesome food is caught without a net or a trap. Bring out the number and weight. Bring out number, weight, and measure in a year of dearth. Well, that seems obvious, doesn't it? No bird soars too high if he soars with his own wings. A dead body revenges not injuries. Okay. That seems like a dangerous invitation. The most sublime act is to set another before you. If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. I like that one. Folly is the cloak of knavery. Shame is pride's cloak. Here's some more. Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion. Blake was what we called a dissenter. Maybe you can see why. The roaring of lions, the howling of wolves, the raging of the stormy sea, and the destructive sword are portions of eternity too great for the eye of man. So see, there it is again. Roaring of lions, howling of wolves, these are things beyond your senses, but not your perhaps sixth sense. The fox condemns the trap, not himself. What if you just live by that? What if you just live by that? You condemn the nature of the world instead of yourself. And ultimately, I hope you would not condemn the nature of the world. Joys impregnate, sorrows bring forth. What is now proved was once only imagined. That's profound, right? So what we now take for granted as obvious and true and even mundane was once only imagined. The cistern contains, the fountain overflows. I like this one too. Everything possible to be believed is an image of truth. Everything that is possible to be believed is an image of truth. The eagle never lost so much time as when he submitted to learn from the crow. Right? Choose your mentors wisely, I guess. And this may be my favorite. You never know what is enough unless you know what is more than enough. All right, a few more from the marriage of heaven and hell. So you see the point. Heaven and hell are these two gateposts. Blake wants to marry them, right? The opposites, there's no progress, there's no progression without contraries. The heads, so now we're kind of moving beyond well, it's still the Proverbs. Let me just read you. The head sublime, the heart pathos, the genitals beauty, the hands and feet proportion. As the air to a bird or the sea to a fish, so is contempt to the contemptible. The crow wished everything was black, the owl that everything was white. Exuberance is beauty. Exuberance is beauty. If the lion was advised by the fox, he would be cunning. But the lion's not really cunning, just powerful and fast. Improvement makes straight roads, but the crooked roads without improvement are roads of genius. So here's to all you crooked roads out there. Sooner murder an infant in its cradle. What do you think's coming next? Sooner murder an infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desires. Okay, it's a little harsh. Where man is not, nature is barren. That's a genius insight, because nature is a human construct. And so if there's no humans there, there's no nature. There's just what is. Truth can never be told so as to be understood and not be believed. All right. Yes. Enough or too much. The ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods or geniuses, calling them by the names and adorning them with the properties of woods, rivers, mountains, lakes, cities, nations, etc., whatever enlarged and numerous senses could perceive. You see, there's that theme again, enlarging your senses. I think Blake would have loved living right now, at least in terms of the technology we have, which is an enlargement of the senses. A telescope allows you to see further with your eye, etc. And particularly, they studied the genius of each city and country, placing it under its mental deity, till a system was formed which some took advantage of and enslaved the vulgar by attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects. That's Plato and the church. Thus began priesthood, choosing forms of worship from poetic tales, and at length they pronounced that the gods had ordered such things. Thus men forgot that all gods live in the human breast. I don't know how he wasn't killed, actually, saying this stuff. All right, here's our passage. The ancient tradition that the world will be consumed in fire at the end of 6,000 years is true, as I have heard from hell. For the cherub with his flaming sword is hereby commanded to leave his guard at the tree of life. And when he does, the whole creation will be consumed and appear infinite and holy, whereas it now appears finite and corrupt. This will come to pass by an improvement of sensual enjoyment. But first, the notion that man has a body distinct from his soul is to be expunged. This I shall do by printing in the infernal method, by corrosives, which in hell are salutary and medicinal, melting apparent surfaces away, which is, you saw, that's what they do, and displaying the infinite which was hid. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. And just a couple more. I was in a printing house in hell, okay, and saw the method in which knowledge is transmitted from generation to generation. In the first chamber was a dragon man, clearing away the rubbish from a cave's mouth. Within, a number of dragons were hollowing the cave. In the second chamber was a viper folding around the rock and the cave, and others adorning it with gold, silver, and precious stones. In the third chamber was an eagle with wings and feathers of air, and he caused the inside of the cave to be infinite. Around were numbers of eagles like men, who built palaces in the immense cliffs. In the fourth chamber were lions of flaming fire, raging around and melting the metals into living fluids. In the fifth chamber were unnamed forms, which cast the metals into the expanse. There they were received by men who occupied the sixth chamber and took the forms of books and were arranged in libraries. The giants who formed this world into its sensual existence and now seem to live in it in chains are in truth the giants who formed this world into its sensual existence and now seem to live in it in chains are in truth the causes of its life and the sources of all activity. But the chains are the cunning of weak and tame minds, which have the power to resist energy, according to the proverb, the weak in courage is strong in cunning. Okay, I think you've got it. And it ends here, that the priests of the raven of dawn, no longer in deadly black, with hoarse note, curse the sons of joy. Nor his accepted brethren, whom tyrant he calls free, lay the bound or build the roof, nor pale religious lechery call that virginity, that wishes but acts not. For everything that lives is holy. Everything. It is extremely difficult to interpret William Blake. He is part Apocalypse or the Book of Revelation in the New Testament. He is part epic poet. He is part artist. But you know who offered the best interpretation of William Blake I've ever read? That's totally objective opinion. But listen to this, because he is extremely difficult. I'm just going to quote you from Manly Hall, this essay, which Kelly found for me is brilliant, 1949. He says, the schools that bestow upon the waiting world an endless stream of buxom nudes insist that we should be satisfied with color, line, and mass, especially mass. Blake broke the prevailing concept, and for that matter, the entire modern concept, by selecting his subject matter from a sphere of cosmic symbolism entirely beyond human experience. He gained a reputation for madness, outraged most of his contemporaries, and suffered the full weight of that penalty which is reserved for courage and originality. At one point, Manly Hall says, it's hard to determine whether Blake was a great pagan Christian or a Christian pagan. Indeed. He says, Blake, Manly Hall, was the first to bring a superb and dynamic artistry to the esoteric tradition. I think that's right. Through him, concepts took fantastic forms such as intrinsic merit, that they are now included among all the greatest productions of human skill. By way of interlude, Manly Hall continues, it should be pointed out that any explanation of Blake's philosophy must be considered, to a degree at least, an interpretation. Thank you. Yes, we don't have to decide. We shouldn't decide. The poetic style is of the mystic. The brevity of his text, and I've never seen anyone comment on this, the brevity of his text and the fantasy which the composition of the universal man exists permeates his literary form and makes it impossible to dogmatize his meanings. Often Blake, the metaphysician, applies his symbolism to several particulars simultaneously. But he made a lot of work for British literary critics who can argue that it's only one of these particulars, right? And there are voluminous journals and books about this. But Manly Hall sees that you apply it to all of them. He must be explained in terms of the convictions of his commentator. What? The text now becomes mirror, and I'm seeing myself in it, so the more I write about Blake, the more I'm writing about me. Blake would love that, right? Therefore, there is considerable confusion around the more obscure phrases of his metaphysical images. Yeah. I love this. The Blakean vision of the universal redemption is reminiscent of the alchemistic doctrine of art perfecting nature. Indeed. And this is my favorite passage of all, and I'll close with this. And let me just read it, because again, I've never heard anyone say this about Blake, and I think it's genius. Quote, Blake's understanding of the Christian mystery was completely mystical in the best sense of that term. He used the word forgiveness in an unusual way. It implied an enlargement of understanding by which things become truly known. Forgiveness. True knowing, in turn, leads to true loving. The human soul, cleansed of unreasonable and unnatural fears. See, 9 writers out of 10, probably 10 writers out of 10 before Blake and before Manly Hall would have put that as cleansed of unreasonable and unnatural sins. No, the human soul cleansed of unreasonable and unnatural fears, because that's where our shit comes from, right? By which things become, relaxes from error to a state of grace. Wouldn't it be nice to relax from error to a state of grace? As the child, confident of the strength and wisdom of its parents, lives without fear, so the enlightened person, sure of the integrities which preserve her, can tease the unnatural struggle against phantoms and abide in a peace that surpasses understanding. What the Easterners call realization, Blake covers by his interpretation of the act of forgiving. Forgiveness is a loving acceptance which has seen through appearances and discovered the reality. It is difficult to confine the dreams of the mystic to the narrow and inadequate structure of words. We must even ask words, Manly Hall, we must even ask words to forgive us for the sins we have committed with them. Words, because we're trying to make them do too much. I'm sorry, words. Please forgive me. In a strange way, man himself, this is Manly Hall, in a strange way, man himself becomes Christ. Of course we do. What's the point of the story otherwise? And achieves through the Christ in himself the salvation of the God which fashioned him. The creature attains the state of forgiveness by forgiving, not by being forgiven. Okay, thank you for your attention.